Welcome. We're glad you could join us. I'm Hef.
And I'm Forrest.
And we are part of the SecurityMetrics Threat Intelligence Center here in beautiful, snowy Silicon Slopes, Utah. And boy, have we got an action-packed show here for you today. We're talking vulnerabilities. It's a vulnerability palooza. My gosh. Sudo, we got Sonic Wall stuff. We've got to talk about all of the global takedowns this past week and a half, 2 weeks. And as always, it's a game for us sometimes, right?
Shall we play a game?
Hey, DJ, play that song for us. Hey, Forrest, it is a smorgasbord. It is a gigantic palooza of vulnerabilities, critical ones, really, over the past 2 weeks.
Oh yeah, whole bunch of stuff. I think first up we have the sudo super user do vulnerability, right?
My gosh, this one is powerful. I'm telling you, to be able to get root privileges and be able to escalate on that for a threat actor, this is the big one. This is the one that, I mean, we're kicking off the show with this one.
Yeah. The this definitely is a pretty big vulnerability. There's a lot of attack surface in sudo. So there's been some considerable scrutiny of it in the past. I believe OpenBSD had decided to try and move away from that and make their own called doas. And I think a lot more platforms are starting to port that just because the much smaller code base and a lot simpler design, so it may not have as much in-depth and niche corner cases and things like that, but still a very good utility. A lot of places are still, because it is so heavily embedded in the environment. I mean, sudo is ubiquitous, so I mean, it's not just Linux. You know, it's affecting Cisco devices, it's affecting Macs. So yeah, this one's definitely a doozy. And above all, update. Get the updates, install them.
Big time. And, you know, with this vulnerability, it's really the researchers that have really been investigating this. I mean, you have to have a computer to try to exploit it. You also have to understand that this has been pretty much around for about 10 years, this vulnerability. But from our perspective in the community, it's our first documentation of it. So it really helps guide us on trying to get a handle of what this vulnerability can do. And then in the news, of course, you know, you mentioned Mac, and that has been the big thing that came out too, as well, is this vulnerability impacts Macs. And there's a lot of folks out there that you don't want to give root access to.
Yeah, I really do wonder if this will spurn new efforts in bringing additional scrutiny to the software, much like OpenSSL back in the day when Heartbleed came out. It was pretty big vulnerability, so brought a lot of attention and development money and things like that to OpenSSL, and you know, people would spun off their own boring SSL or LibreSSL. I wonder if we'll start to see things like that happen with sudo and doas.
Yeah, a big shout out to researcher Matthew Hickley, who was able to find and really talk a lot about the bug and how it can be exploited specifically on Macs. Thank you for that kind of work. So what we'll do is we'll include some links and information on how to take care of this in your environment. And of course, we're going to continue on this vulnerability palooza. Forrest, what do you think we switch gears for a moment and we talk about the big topic? The big thing that's really popping the news this past week has been, of course, the takedown of Emotet and the disruption to Netwalker. Wow.
Yeah.
Woo. Yeah, finally.
The crowd goes wild. Man, yeah, this was pretty wild. I think a lot of people were too caught up on following GameStop to really pay attention to this, but pretty big, awesome, successful news for, you know, international efforts to take these down. It's great to see these networks that have just caused so much harm finally be brought in.
The sad thing, though, Forrest, is there's so many others. Ransomware as a service, folks waiting to take up the slack now that Emotet is down. And let's start with Emotet, because that disruption of their infrastructure has been a huge news story. What caught my eye, of course, is the whole takedown and the disruption was really led by Europol, and it was really a cross a cornucopia, all right, of different law enforcement agencies and authorities. And I thought it was so cool, man, to see the Canadian Mounties. I mean, we don't get to hear about them too often, but they were involved in this infrastructure takedown.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. I actually watched a video of the raid and them just going through and having to tag all the evidence and everything, and it was pretty wild. There's naturally a bunch of cash everywhere, tons of silver. But what blew me away was they were going through all the hardware, and there's this old slot one motherboard sitting there on the side. It was like a computer graveyard, man. I hadn't seen one of those since like probably 2004. That motherboard's old enough to drink. It's
right.
Pretty crazy, some of the stuff that they had there.
Well, a lot of folks, you might be joining the podcast for the first time, and you may not be familiar with how Emotet works and why it's so dangerous out there. So we've included some links in our podcast to make sure you understand how the luring of the victim works, how it gets installed, and how the infection works. So what makes Emotet so dangerous and why it really needed to be off this planet as much as possible is it's more than just malware, folks. It's beyond all that. It's a type of loader operation, and it's one of the biggest players in the market, especially in the world of ransomware as a service. And when you combine that with malware operators like TrickBot and Rook, they all benefit from this Emotet. So having this being taken down is awesome. And we've included a lot of links and places to go to find more information on how this stuff works, because it's a lot to try to describe and teach in a half-hour podcast. So, but yeah, Emotet, so awesome to see that being taken off the market. There was more stuff in the news, and of course we don't want to leave anything out, but Forrest, thankfully, Netwalker, yay!
Yeah, another one taken down. So pretty good week all in all for for the guys on the blue team.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with how Netwalker operates, it's actually a ransomware as a service. You have developers, you have affiliates, and these developers are responsible for creating and updating the ransomware. Meanwhile, you have these affiliates who are going then and trying to use the lures and trying to get the infection. From there, you have this security key exchange. You have files being encrypted, the victim's files being encrypted. And then from there, you have, of course, the extortion element of it. So the good news is it was a Canadian national who they allegedly got. And in this case, he is being held, and it's so good, though, to see this partnership between the Department of Justice and the Bulgarian cyber folks taking down a lot of this operation. So good for us. Yay, blue team, as you always like to say. But Forrest, the ransomware race, it's like the Olympics. Hand off the baton to another ransomware player. There's all these newcomers on the market that are taking up the slack.
Yep. It's whack-a-mole, really. Take one out and one's going to pop up to take its place. So, we've got some up and coming. They're starting to come about. I believe the big one that you were mentioning was the Ransom EXX. They're just coming onto the scene. There were a few others that were cited in that article that you had linked in there.
Yeah, and we've included that link too, because the company called Digital Shadows put out a great quarterly report on the state of ransomware. And it's always fascinating when you look at what the market is like for ransomware and ransomware as a service. And essentially what you'll find is there are 6 major ransomware operators that operate in the market. And out of these 6, there's about 84% of all known attacks last year came from these 6 players, which you would think, you hear about it in the news all the time. You hear all these different ransomware groups, but to understand and to see it visually was very helpful from the folks over at Digital Shadows. And the ransomware race continues. And this is a great pie graph if you've not seen this yet from Digital Shadows. I mean, and the trend is really this double extortion method. And that's what we're seeing a lot right now in the industry, where it's basically you pay or you get breached. And as we know, a lot of these gangs are out there. They're basically saying, hey, we're going to encrypt your data. We'll give you the key if you pay. And we promise, Forrest, that we're going to refrain from selling it to other crime gangs that are out there. But it doesn't actually mean they're not going to go out and sell it to other crime gangs.
Yep. Yeah. It's not just a double dip, potentially a triple dip. If they, you pay to get access to your data back, you pay to prevent them from leaking it, and then they turn around and somebody else pays them again for additional access to it. So, it's just a real scummy situation all around.
Yeah, and a lot of these gangs, we talk about the double extortion method. It's not just about getting the decryption key to get your data back, but the big concern now is, well, are they going to exfiltrate the data off the network and then sell it to somebody else? So the double extortion method is a trend that we're going to continue to see into 2021. And really what it comes down to, if a company pays a ransom and presumably the data is deleted for us, then no one sees it, right? But without a payment, the data can then be exposed, and you then have to go on record and say, oh, we've officially had a data breach, which, in my opinion, that's not really the ethical thing to do. I mean, if you've been breached in any way, such or form, you obviously have to make an announcement of some sort. But in this case, once the data becomes publicly available, there's no chance getting it back. So these ransomware gangs really do have you by, the front end and the back end with their double extortion methods. So let's switch gears for a moment. Let's talk about the different ransomware strains that are out there. And again, Digital Shadows put out this fantastic report for the quarter. You would think by looking at this chart, you would see all these different strains. And these are the top 10 strains from 2014 to 2020. And it gives you this false impression, Forrest, right, that there are all these different groups of ransomware attacks that are out there, but that may not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of concentration. It's almost like car manufacturers, right? There's a whole laundry list of them, but the bulk majority are going to come down to these major 5 or 6 ones. That's where you're seeing a lot of the concentration of it. So I think the big ones were like Maze, Ryuk, Netwalker, that's thankfully now shut down. Doppelpaymer, there's probably a few others that I'm missing from that top 5 or 6 that you had mentioned, make up somewhere around 84% of all the ransomware.
And what's really interesting from a ransomware ecosystem perspective is a lot of these ransomware as a service affiliates, they're just migrating between all these different strains. So while you may see this one strain in the news, they could very, very well be using other strains to carry out their attacks. So it's definitely a challenge from our perspective, trying to understand it all and being able to identify the threat vector in the client's environment. And on that note, we kind of want to wrap up our little ransomware race, the ransomware Olympics, I don't know what you want to call it, but the number of industries being targeted, and so many of these attacks with ransomware are opportunistic attacks where it's not just geographical, and it's not just so much one targeted industry, but it's all over the place. There's no bias when it comes to their attack vectors.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's a very wide distribution of it. You do see a lot of, a little bit of a focus on, for instance, like healthcare, where I think there's a measure of urgency or desperation, where, the longer systems are down, the higher the chance that somebody will end up dying as a result of this, or various places like, service providers, managed service providers, professional services, things like that. There's a bit of a concentration there, but I mean, everything else, it's fair game. Education, public sector, retail, it's all over the place.
Yeah, and nearly 1/3 of all of last year's attacks were essentially hitting the industrial goods sector, the services sector. And if you recall, Forrest, there was a story back in Germany of last year where a hospital was hit with ransomware and a patient allegedly died. So there's that investigation that's currently ongoing as well. So these attacks, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you could still be potentially targeted. So good stuff. Excellent. We've included all the links to dive into this report from Digital Shadows, and bravo on that report for the quarter. Let's switch gears, Forrest. Why don't we talk about data breaches? Oh my gosh, TikTok, they don't stop.
Oh joy, my favorite.
And I know our audience probably loves talking about data breaches, but we thought we'd start off with the vulnerability stuff this week and the big takedowns. But now let's get right into the data breaches. There were a ton over the past 2 weeks, and the chart that comes out from these folks here at IT Governance, and they did a great story about it, about all the different data breaches from January of 2021. 800, oh my gosh, Forrest, 878 million records breached.
Yeah, pretty crazy amount, almost 1 billion, and we're just barely starting the year out. So, yeah, it doesn't necessarily bode well. The big thing that stood out to me was, they also had compiled all the breaches from 2020 and total number of records and things like that, and it averaged about 2 million records per breach. The big thing with just these ones that have been disclosed so far, we're sitting at about 82 breaches that they had identified, and closer to over 10 million records per breach. So almost a 5-fold increase, and I'm not sure if that trend is going to continue. Other trends that I was seeing was showing it had doubled year over year from 2019 to 2020. So I definitely expect there to be a much higher overall volume, but whether or not that pans out to end up being a 5-fold increase or not, we'll see.
Now, the thing about these breaches and this link that we're going to include to all the breaches that happened here for January of 2021, you can look at them, but you have to remember that a lot of these breaches happened back in September and October and August. So by the time it makes the public news, there's always that little bit of a delay. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some companies, they like to delay announcing any kind of breach until after the quarterly earnings report comes out, which, is probably not the best thing to do if you're a customer of the company and has my data been breached or not, and you're waiting that delay. But January is typically a slow month for breaches, and you'd be surprised. I mean, I know there's a lot in this list, but typically you don't really see these big announcements come out till kind of mid-September and I'm sorry, the summer months. So, but yeah, that's what's going on for the summary for January. So the nice folks at Google in their threat center is they put out this social engineering warning. It really, any vulnerability researcher out there, you got to be aware of this, because essentially you can be socially engineered through the web on, being targeted about collaborating with other vulnerability researchers out there.
Yeah, it's in my opinion, this kind of approach is pretty deadly, because there's a lot of collaboration and cooperation and free flow of information and information security when people are trying to work on something. So trying to get together on a project is pretty common. The problem is how often are people taking these things and treating them as malware, throwing them in a sandbox to detonate or try and analyze what the output of it is. It assumes that a lot of developers probably aren't doing these things in a sandboxed or isolated environment where a lot of people just treat their dev environment as their dev environment. They're just going to build things and move fast and break stuff. How many people are actually going to go through the rigmarole of trying to keep things isolated in such a way that doesn't impact their daily workflow?
Yeah, on top of all that too, the sandboxing and what caught my eye in this one is these vulnerability researchers, allegedly what you're seeing is North Korean hackers are creating fake profiles, and a lot of these fake profiles are people you may never even heard of before. And, they're new accounts. So they say account created in October of 2020. And here it is. If you're a researcher and you get a message from somebody that just recently created an account, somebody you've never heard from in the community before, you might raise a red flag there. But a lot of these researchers did not. And essentially what these folks are doing, these hackers, is they're sending them DLL files inside Visual Studio Project that has custom malware in it. And then that's where the bad stuff happens. So it's really wild to see this type of social engineering. And like you mentioned, I mean, there's so many lessons learned to be grabbed from these situations. So we hope that awareness is key for a lot of these vuln researchers out there. All right, let's flip gears for a moment. We're talking about breaches and Bonobos. Have you ever shopped there?
I have not. Style and fashion are definitely not my strong suits.
Well, don't worry about it because these guys have been breached. And the story goes Shiny Hunters, the advanced persistent threat Shiny Hunters is behind this one. Bonobos is interesting because they're owned by Walmart. So they have that backing of the Walmart cyber team. But what happened is we have this breach. Basically, the breach goes that Shiny Hunters was able to steal some databases. In fact, the full Bonobos database, about 70 gigabytes. That's a lot of stuff to steal. And Bonobos came out and put out this briefing that said, hey, none of the internal systems were hit. We're okay. We're going to go back to a backup file and we'll be all right. Everything's okay. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Nothing to see. But I mean, this is a pretty big one in the past 2 weeks.
Yeah. If I remember rightly, the breach wasn't according to them wasn't in their internal systems. It was some offsite backup somewhere. So if you're storing data offsite somewhere, some cloud provider, what have you, still needs to be encrypted. Still needs to have access controls.
Yeah, and this one, we talk about being how big this breach is. 7 million customer records, account information for about 1.8 million registered customers, and then you have about 3.5 million partial credit card records. So it's critical. Lessons learned here is how you store that data. And they mentioned the database being hashed using SHA-256 and SHA-512, but if the threat actors can get through all that, and if you're not encrypting your data at rest in the right way, and you're not encrypting your data in transit, then you're going to get popped. So it'll be interesting to see how the class action lawsuit comes out of this one. We do have another breach that we need to talk about, and this one really caught my eye, especially when you talk about 2, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there were a lot of sextortion type hacks. Do you remember some of those?
Yeah, the Ashley Madison, all that, yeah.
Yeah, and in this one, it's Meet Mindful, which is a dating website, and 2.28 million users. A lot of information in that breach. You're talking usernames, real names, email addresses, dating preferences, and I had to underline it, marital status, because that's the big one when it comes to sextortion. We don't know exactly what the intentions are of these threat actors that are behind this. It's potentially believed that it is Shiny Hunters, APT. And as we understand it, again, when you're hacking a dating site, all right, hacking a dating site, the concern is, of course, sextortion. So something to keep an eye on as this one hits the class action lawsuits as well.
Yeah, a lot of blackmail opportunity there.
All right, probably our newest breach, since we're going to publication here in the newscast, is the Drive Sure. I call it Drive Unsure. I see a lot of their commercials on television. A lot of people use Drive Sure and their clients of Drive Sure, but 3.2 million, here we go, 3.2 million, right? 3.2 million clients. Oh my gosh, for 91 sensitive databases exposed in this breach.
Yeah, a lot of pretty juicy information was able to be taken away from this. Phone numbers, emails, physical addresses, names, car, make, model, year, VIN, all kinds of really specific information that could be very useful. The big thing that I see for this is a possible avenue for further social engineering. Sending out emails, recall notice for XYZ kind of thing. It's going to be very interesting to see how people then try and turn around and exploit this even further.
Yeah, that VIN number, I mean, once that's out there in the open with the car make, the model, your address, all that information, there's a lot of exposure out there for you, the person. So it'll be interesting, again, to see how this one plays out in the news as well. Well, Forrest, what do you think? We kind of wrap this up here with some odds and ends. I like to call it the cyber mystery grab bag. Do you like that?
Yeah. I miss the days when you could go down to the corner market and 25 cent, grab a bag of candy and who knows what's in it.
I was thinking more like the Walmart bin where they have those $5 DVDs. This is our $5 stories. All right. What do you think?
I like it. Let's go for it.
All right. So there's a lot of stories, and a lot of them don't kind of fit into the neat little, it's not a vulnerability. It's not maybe ransomware related. So here we go. We got a couple stories that caught our eye, and, picking out the right story to tell you and the audience is kind of tough. But the first one that I want to talk about is the vaccine scheduling. So especially here in the United States, a lot of people are getting their scheduling for their vaccines. And what's interesting is a lot of these government agencies are in such a rush, Forrest. They're in such a rush to get to the market, to get people scheduled, that they're not doing their due diligence on this software and on the websites.
Yeah, yeah. And who knows, some of this stuff could be coming from, insider information. Somebody tells someone, hey, I know a way you can skip to the front of the line, just use this link. And then it slowly spreads from there as word of mouth gets out, and, everybody wants to jump to the front of the line. And then all of a sudden, they find out that this is happening and everybody gets booted.
Yeah. And this one happened in Michigan. The trend line is, and it's my perception, of course, I do believe you're going to start to hear more about these kind of stories where there are backdoors on websites to schedule your vaccine, where they're not locked down, they're not secure, and you're able to get in and schedule your vaccine ahead of everyone else. So we're going to start to potentially see that these kinds of stories really evolve. The other story that caught our eye was disinformation campaigns, and this one came out of the European Union. So as we understand it, what happened in the European Union is Pfizer and EMA submitted documentation, vaccine documents, confidential stuff to the EU regulatory bodies for approval. And what hackers were able to do is get that information, falsify some of the submission's contents, and then publish it online with the false information. So really, they're manipulating the correspondence between the regulatory bodies and these vaccine companies. And, not a lot of news stories are picking up on this, but this is huge, Forrest.
Yeah, I've been seeing so much disinformation. It's been astounding. I saw just, I believe today, that somebody had made some claims about the number of deaths and vaccines, and quoted some numbers from VAERS, VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Effects and Reactions, something. Anyway, completely misquoted numbers, and just goes to show that you can't really trust what people are putting out there. You have to go to the source itself. Don't trust a random screenshot. Somebody can go in, inspect element, change it to whatever they want. It's definitely need to exercise caution, and it's definitely verify any claims that are being made, because there's a whole lot getting thrown around every which way.
Yeah. And, if these hackers can stoke fear, if they can sow distrust, they could damage reputations and really undermine the overall trust in vaccines, then what you have is a serious situation on your hands. So this was a dark web post, and it was talking about astonishing fraud, evil Pfizer, fake vaccines, all that stuff. And there were some potential links back to a Russian language site. So this stuff, lessons learned from this situation is, it's a hot commodity right now, disinformation on the dark web, especially not just the dark web, but the regular web as well. But as we understand it, this is potentially the first example where we're seeing vaccine documents being manipulated and then published to create disinformation.
Yep. Going back to that old FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yeah, right? Okay, so Sophos, we're kind of down to our last few stories here, but we want to talk about Sophos. Some researchers at Sophos are doing a fantastic job of trying to understand how Agent Tesla malware has been evolving. And what we're seeing in the industry is new delivery and evasion techniques. And Sophos did a pretty good job of trying to explain the two different stages of how Tesla malware is being basically changed, and it's being done so in a way to target the AMSI, which is the Microsoft's anti-malware scan interface. So if you can manipulate that, then you could potentially defeat endpoints. And for companies like Sophos and CrowdStrike and these endpoint vendors, this is a huge deal.
Yeah. Being able to defeat the native anti-malware service is a pretty big deal. So yeah, once you do that, you're sitting pretty.
Yeah, and if this Tesla agent malware can be manipulated, and it really what it comes down to then is it'll be more successful against defeating the endpoints. It'll be more successful against any sort of sandbox defense. And if you do have malware scanners in your environment like AMSI, then there's a workaround for that. So this is going to be a great story to keep following and keeping your eye on as malware does keep evolving, and it's always going to keep evolving. Let's kind of wrap it up here with modern day ransomware attacks. I mentioned the word evolving, and the NCSC, which is the National Cybersecurity Center, out of Britain. They talked about they had a really, I thought it was a good blog article, and I think we need to talk about it with the audience. Is the evolution, and we mentioned this seems like to be a trend here today in the podcast, is the evolution of malware. And they mentioned a use case, and the use case for us was an unnamed company. They did not say the name of the company, but these companies are paying the Bitcoin. And in this example, they paid $6.5 million for a decryption key to restore their network. But what they failed to do, drum roll please. Yeah, they failed to analyze how the infiltration happens. And we see that, Forrest, we see that so often, man, where these companies are just, they're in a rush to restore the network. They're in a rush to get their data back, but they're not willing to spend the time on the incident management piece to really dive into, or are they still in our environment or not? Nobody knows. But hey, we got our data back. We're okay. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along, move along.
Yeah, root cause analysis is definitely a critical piece of any kind of incident response. I mean, yeah, what good does gathering the horses back up and putting them in the barn if you don't close the door? It's you don't really take anything away from that.
My gosh. And they pay the money, they pay the ransomware to get the decryption key back, but they didn't do their due diligence. And then 2 weeks later, this unnamed company was hit again by the same ransomware gang. And that's the kind of stuff, for us that drives you nuts from our perspective. It's like you spend all that energy, time, and money to get your data back, but then you don't do the hard legwork. So this is going to be a trend that continues. Well, thankfully, though, in the United States, at least, there's a lot of laws in place now that you're unable to even pay the ransom. So the FTC, the Trade Commission, the Treasury Department, they now have laws in place that says, if your company's breached and you're being asked to pay ransomware, you're not allowed to pay it. And they went even further and said, a couple months ago, they said, you not only can you not pay the ransom, but we're not even going to allow you to hire a third party or an intermediary company to go and pay the ransom. So a lot of locks have been put down and blocks to try to stop this double take of ransomware.
Yeah, that's above all, that's just insult to injury, and just a lot of unnecessary stress for a second round.
Yeah, and it's only going to get worse. And again, awareness is key that this is going on out there. All right, Parler, back in the news. Oh my gosh. Forrest, DDoS is the company they hired to get their internet back online and get their app and everything running again. But some security researcher out there really dived into this, and they figured out that DDoS, a Russian-based company, actually incorporated down in Belize, at least on paper, to try to get a large swath of IP addresses. But what they didn't know was that this researcher had reported them to the Internet Registry, and all those IPs that they got from Belize were taken away from them. So that knocked Parler back offline.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see if these same kind of tactics are leveraged against, for instance, like domains. A lot of domain registries have various requirements where you need to be, physically reside in a country to use their top level domain or conduct business in them, or various things like that. So it's a very interesting piece of a very interesting potential vulnerability where that could be exploited to take a service down.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the story caught my eye, because you don't hear about that too often. Let's also kind of wrap this up here with the Idology report. And there's tons, folks. There are tons of security reports. At some future podcast, we'll probably do a list of the best reports that you need to read. They come out annually. Reports from CrowdStrike and Verizon. The DBIR report's a big one. The Poneman report. All of them focus on different topics. And Idology focuses on fraud. And their fraud annual trend report for fraud came out. It's their 8th report. We've included a link that you can find if you'd like to download it, and we highly recommend it because it talks about trends, and we in the industry try to follow the trends, and you always want to be on the front end of it. You want to be the leader, trying to see where the industry is going and really having a plan with wherever the criminals are going before they go there. So what we're seeing in the fraud report, and I'll summarize it as quickly as I can here, but the criminals are really, they're taking advantage, of course, of the online flow and all these people working remotely and the whole pandemic chaos. But the fraud report said trend lines will continue for hacked voicemails. We talked about phishing in the last podcast, reproduction of SIM cards, siphoning false payments, and of course, open false credit card accounts, opening those. So the fraud report did a good job of highlighting what it's been like in the past year.
What I find interesting is a lot of these are phone, targeting phone services. So, like you said, voicemails, SIM swapping, things like that, where it's a lot of the time you're seeing phones used as a form of two-step authentication, where or a lot of these are used for phishing. I think going forward, multi-factor authentication is going to have to be something that is not phishable. And isn't dependent on these weaker systems like phone verification, something like U2F or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So the trend report's available. You can definitely download it if you'd like. We highly recommend it, reading all of the reports as they come out annually. And in a future podcast, we'll definitely go into the must reads that, it's a checklist for us. I put it right in my calendar, what report's coming out and what the topic is, and be sure that I try to grab it. So last but not least, we don't want to end the story on a sad note. I mean, it always seems like, Forrest, we talk about some of the Schadenfreude stuff that's out there, but Joker Stash. Have you ever heard of Joker Stash?
I had not, actually.
Well, they're a card shop, and they're probably one of the hottest card shops going all the way back to about 2014, if I remember correctly. The first time I ever got exposed to it was learning about it from Krebs on Security. Fantastic site. So the admin that runs Joker Stash is allegedly saying that he's going to close up shop. I can't believe it. It'll be shocking to see if the Joker Stash gets closed on February 15th, and then potentially if the admin decides to start up a new site. Who knows, right? But these things do have a life cycle, and these life cycles obviously have come to a close for this particular card selling site. You can go to this site on the dark web, and that's where the folks are going to buy their cards. So it is one of the largest. At one point, it seemed like everybody on the wrong side of the law was buying their credit cards through Joker Stash. So it'll be good to see if it gets shut down.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially where a lot of these are, anonymized. They could be potentially, like you said, shutting down. Maybe they'll spin up shop elsewhere. Maybe this person's actually looking to retire and sail off into the sunset. Maybe they're feeling the heat from law enforcement and, feel it's time to shut down, and maybe they'll try again. Maybe they won't. Who knows? It's hard to say.
Yeah, heck yeah. All right, guys, we hope you enjoyed the show. As always, it's a pleasure to get to talk to everybody. And, if you shoot us a comment, we'll try to respond to you. And we love people that click on us and subscribe. And I always said, if we get 5,000 subscribers, I'll whip out the Chris Farley impersonation. So you can find us on all the major channels. On behalf of Forrest, myself, and the entire team at SecurityMetrics here in Silicon Slopes, thanks for joining us. Take care.